Welcome to Explore, Explain, Highlights. In this highlights package, we'll be looking at Season 3, Episode 8, with our guest, Ros Pearce, discussing the project Nearly Half of Mariupol Has Suffered Grave Damage.
And then accompanying that, I've also got some bar charts just giving a breakdown of the proportion that were damaged by type of building. So industrial were the most hit, but residential buildings had also a really large area damaged, partly just because they make up a large area of the city.
Right.
And then below that, we've got a time series as well, just sort of showing when this happened. And it basically happened fairly steadily since the beginning.
So from the point of view of how things arise internally at The Economist, how does a piece like this originate? Is it because, as you mentioned, your colleague Ainsley recognised the possibility of a methodology and then that kind of inspired the idea for this work? Or was it that the work, something about damage, something about the war's potential kind of economic costs especially, was something worth pursuing, and then that led to the discovery of the methodology? Where's the chicken, where's the egg in this case?
Well, I can't speak exactly to what my colleague Ainsley was thinking, but in general, we were trying to cover the war in Ukraine in the graphic detail section because we thought it had quite a lot of visual potential. Another colleague of mine also explored satellite data showing where bombings happened, but like for some reason or another, there was some like methodological reasons that we weren't sure it was accurate. But Ainsley, basically found the data for this, realized it was feasible. Also because we had on the ground data from the UN for a portion of the city, which meant we were able to like sort of fact check our own like code. So it should be fairly accurate. So it was sort of data first and then story data.
To the extent you can, what's the process of how you kind of captured damaged buildings?
Okay, so this is going to be a very rough guide because
sure, that's what we need.
did most of it. But yeah, as I understand it, so we use data from the European satellite Sentinel-1A, which has this instrument on board called an SAR, which sends microwaves out. If the building has been reduced to rubble, then more of these microwaves will be reflected back to the satellite because I think they just sort of bounce away otherwise. And if the building has been flattened, then that results in like a change in the phase of the wave being returned to the satellite. So we're looking for changes in amplitude and changes in the phase. And we had like a satellite image before the war that we could compare it to, and we basically like compared these two images. And then because we also had data from OpenStreetMap of like where the buildings were and their type, we then sort of like overlaid that on the buildings and tried to work out which buildings were damaged from that. Yeah.
So in the sense that the damage is determined by the delta, the changes between two states. It's not something that is directly measurable, but it can be assumed when you've got a before and after to create that sense of calculation. Now, one of the things that you speak about later on is the possibility of doing something where you would show how these damages have occurred over time. So did you have potentially access to multiple different phases of this sort of satellite measurements to enable you to do, I don't know, week 1, week 2, week 3 kind of sequencing?
So we essentially had data every week, which I believe that's just how often the satellite went over that particular spot, I think. We had it sort of starting on, I think the first one was like the 28th of February, which was around when the siege began, and then we had it like for I think 4 weeks after that. Our last one was on the 17th of April, which is sort of not that long before when we published it.
I see.
I originally thought that, we've got this, like, this is fantastic, we've got data through time, we can like show the progression of the siege through the city. But then I quite quickly realized that firstly there wasn't like that much of a pattern. It just seemed like they'd sort of been targeting like all different bits of the city, like sort of throughout, and it just sort of steadily gets worse. And also I realized it was just going to be too complicated to do a sort of like a color scheme showing different like time periods of damage, and then also comparing that to undamaged. It just like, because the buildings are so small that you really need like bright color to contrast with that. Otherwise,
rather than some sort of graduated color scheme, which wouldn't be sort of visibly detectable to the eye. Yeah. To what extent did you feel that you had to be just very aware of the sensitivities of the subject matter with any of the choices that you made, given that it's about war and it's about people's buildings and their home cities? Obviously, a lot of the photo imagery includes images of people and kind of close-up damage. But, you know, to what extent was that a thread always sort of running at the back of your mind, and especially with regards to even the language of how this event is being described, you know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I guess there's a broader The Economist house style approach way to handle this that you have to inherit and take that responsibility.
Yeah, so I do think that's a bit of an issue for data viz in general, just because it's a slightly sort of cold numbers based art anyway. So I do think there was a bit of a risk of being a bit insensitive by just reducing everything to numbers, which is partly why in the web version we thought it would be good to have some images from the city, just to add a bit more of a sort of like, I don't know,
human
like
texture.
Exactly. And I do think that you can get so sort of excited about the map and you're sort of like just thinking about the data viz that you can easily forget about it, or not even forget about it. It's almost like if you like continually think about how dreadful all the things you're mapping are, it can get a bit depressing. Almost like a coping mechanism, maybe.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I did actually previously spend like 5 years working for a climate change website, and I definitely found that while I was doing that, I sort of just narrowed in on the work I was doing without actually thinking about it too much, because if I thought about it all the time, it would just be really depressing.
Well, that's it.
But I also think, that said, like I do try to be careful, like in terms of the language used and also in terms of the colors. So normally I would be a little bit wary of using reds for depicting war and like death and destruction. Because I think there's a bit of a risk of ending up with a sort of like, it looks too much like blood. It could be a bit of a like horrible visual metaphor. But I think in this case, so actually I tried to go with a blue color scheme for the map, because I thought it sort of set a more somber tone. But then I found that the blue actually wasn't bright enough. It didn't really stand out. And in the end, I decided that our Economist red was actually fine, because although it's a red, it's a more orangey red, so it doesn't look too much like blood, but it does give you a sense of sort of warning. Of like, look at this. It has that kind of like urgency. Yes, so when I first joined The Economist, I think there was a little bit more of a print first mindset, just because of history, but we are trying to move towards like them both being equally important and giving more space to think about what needs to be changed for the web, because of that, like obviously there are very different formats. So for example, for print, you're looking at the page all at once, which actually means like you need to design it quite differently. You need to make sure that because you're not sort of seeing things in a flow of information, it needs to make sense if you're just absorbing it all at once. But then with web, you can have a bit more of a structured narrative, because you're showing people stuff in a sequence. So yeah, our sort of web, and actually I think in the very early days of the Economist website, we just sort of bung charts in a JPEG, which obviously is like not great, because a sort of flat like pixel based image is just going to look quite blurry. So now we at minimum try to use AI to HTML for our sort of like premium data viz, which essentially means that the text renders really crisply, because it's actually HTML text sort of hovering over image. And then also with AI to HTML, you can make responsive versions, so it looks it's like legible on a mobile and other screen sizes essentially. Yeah, we've recently also expanded our interactive visual journalist team a lot. So we're also doing like more ambitious things with yeah, not just necessarily making AI to HTML, something made in print. We're making sort of like whole new things. And in the web version of this one, we did do a slider just showing sort of comparing the SAR satellite data with like how the buildings actually looked. So yeah, the answer is we're trying to like make sure that they're equal.
To what extent do you do things before you get into the data and the visuals? To what extent do you do things like sketching or initial, I don't know, maybe initial research about how others have tackled a similar kind of product, or do you pretty much just going to get straight into the data, straight into the tools, and see what emerges through that sort of crafting method?
I think it kind of depends on the type of visualization. So for a map, often like sketching it isn't actually particularly helpful. It's better to just sort of have a play around in QGIS, because that will sort of almost do the sketching for you. Like, and the same with like certain visualizations. Often I find, so we use an R package called ggplot, which I find is very useful for just quickly trying different types of chart with the same data. Just sort of change a line and try a different chart. But I do sometimes do sketches when I find that the concept or like a bit confusing, and I just need to almost like work it out.
Right.
Like I sort of have an idea and I want to just quickly communicate it to my colleague. But like if it's the kind of thing where it might take a while to just draw up a draft of it. So yeah, the answer is sometimes, but sometimes I think it's because we're working in quite a short time frame, it's quicker to just sort of start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's good to hear, because I think some people who do just pen and paper sketching forget that they can use tools in a sense to be a way to sketch. And others who just use tools forget that you can use pen and paper and just do rough ideas on paper to see if it's working, especially if you're working with colleagues and you need to sort of show the what's buzzing around your head. Here's what it looks like in my head. Are we on the same page with this?
Thank you for joining us for this Explore, Explain highlights episode. As always, the full episode is available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. We hope to see you again soon on another episode of Explore, Explain.